record.
Oh, great.
Progress.
Sweet.
So as it turns out, yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before, I was talking with John Vervaeke about more or less this issue, right? So the notion of organizational form, which is a very complex question. I'm looking forward to just delving into it deeply, as being necessary for us to be able to do all the other stuff. So let's just make it sort of very broad, that we need to do. So is it necessary for the things that are necessary? And this is, I think, I completely agree. And the premise is something like trying to think the right example. You know, if you're a crab tasked with the problem of typing, you know, you could, of course, for some while kind of try to peck it out with your claws. But if you had the capacity to actually create hands, you might be much further along. And if you're dealing with an even bigger problem, like turning a screwdriver or something like that, then a hand becomes requisite. And I think it's something along those lines. Like we're actually dealing with something where I'll just say organizational form. I think we should double click on what we mean by that. But organizational form carries with it simultaneously implicit consequences. Many of the legacy forms have implicit consequences that we don't want, and simply curtails certain things that we actually need to have, right? So we have to work at that level, and then once we have that foundation, we begin to see how do we use that foundation to actually how do we deploy that new foundation? Like once we've developed the physical human body, how do we actually then learn how to make it dance, for example?
Yeah, so I think this gets to some really critical points. I really agree. And in a way, most of our organizational theory, to be reductive and generalist, has come from theories of control. There are extensions of organizational theory imbued from classical military theories of power, control, and control as a mechanism of organizing.
Mm-hmm.
And control as a mechanism of organizing is very good for a linear predictive mold. It's very good for a universal theory of value, universal kind of theories of comprehension of the world. However, for a complex emergent world, control-based organizing starts to become limited. And I think what we're reaching is two thresholds. One is in a complex world, our ability to orchestrate value through linear predictability is creating far too many losses, non-linear losses. And secondly, I think our capacity as an organ, we have built the bureaucratic capacity for moving beyond theories of control. So new technologies are opening up landscapes of a bureaucratic revolution, which allow us to orchestrate, let's put it this way, from a kind of debt and predictive world to a quasi-mass multi-equity world. And they're kind of using a financial landscape. And I think that mass micro-equity world actually starts to create a different theory of value formation. And that requires different organizational forms. And I think that organizational theory means that, like in sort of perverse, simplistic terms, you go from the CEO being a control mechanism in a complex world, because actually the CEO can't perceive the complexity of the system. So I think classical information studies have shown CEOs have 7% of the knowledge of critical failure points in the system. And boards are even worse, because boards become even more abstractive holders of risk, the disassociation of risk from the embodied agency and leadership. And so boards become increasingly risk averse because they can't perceive the risk or manage it. They're disembodied actors. And that drives a predictive conservatism into the organizational form, which means value can't be discovered and organized. So I think there's something systemic in the structuring of the corporate form that is coming to the end of its cycle. And we could argue, and is that sort of 17th century, the corporate form was born in the 17th century as a mechanism of disassociating the investment framework from the risk of failure and creating that separation. And over time, as like Catherine Pistoi's work has shown on kind of a code of capital, that separation is now becoming part of the problem in a complex world. And I think so there's something profound going on in terms of, and this also challenges theories. And again, labor, management, capital, the classic orchestration models that we've had, and the classic discourses of, and I think people are so used to theories of labor and capital as a means of organizing, they're not able to see that in complexity terms, those distinctions no longer work either for management, orchestration, to labor. There's a completely different compact required, yet the default of the argument returns to labor and capital as we're locked into this binary discourse, which I think is problematic on both sides. And there's something interesting in there that, like, when you bring people together in order to be progressive, they think unionism is a theory of progression, which is like, well, maybe. Yet I can see why in an industrial world, unionism was about the equity of power between capital and human labor and finding new balances.
Yep.
But in a complex, entangled world, we need a new relationship of power and orchestration in a complex where value might be discovered at the front line in ways that management or orchestration will never be able to perceive. The front line is the quarterback of the system, not the CEO. So in that worldview, like, the CEO is the learning engine, whereas actually they're an enabling force, but the real quarterbacks on the front line. So even our pay and valuation mechanisms start to have to pivot in really radical terms. Like we used to host hubs and sort of co-working spaces for social entrepreneurs. But what was really clear was the real value creator was the host, who was weaving and networking people together, yet they were the lowest paid employees. So those people were the quarterbacks in the system. And we've not pivoted from the theories of management being the extractive control risk holding system to actually the value creation in a complex world. So I think there's a fundamental move going on.
Yeah, so let me just throw a couple of things in there as like pop-out boxes. So one pop-out box is kind of like the basin of attraction of a legacy system. So there's an activation energy or a minimum viable degree of novelty or new approach that's necessary, lest you inevitably just find yourself dropping back down into the sort of the fundamental axioms of the legacy system. And so, as you say, if we import, because it's just if we aren't ready, willing, and able to really think deeply enough, and we import a series of, let's say, like you said, labor and capital. If we import labor and capital into the way that we're thinking about the new approach, we've actually already finished the game, right? That will inevitably just bring us back to the same place that we left after what might be a decade of circling it for a while. So the inquiry would be something like, how do we actually properly think about designing some new form so that we're able to avoid that basin of attraction and also actually land in a new location that has functional coherence, right? Isn't just sort of a random search of novelty space, because that's going to be exhausting. Of the sort of the classic evolutionary approach is, let's just throw an arbitrarily large number of possibilities at the space and then iterate as things seem to work. And that's, well, there's lots of good reasons to believe that's not the appropriate approach right now. So what's the theory of design that would allow us to actually make this move in a completely new mode? Right? So I think that's a proper question. And I would bring in the fact that I think even like 3 days ago, I was talking with the gentleman, Kevin Owocki at Gitcoin, who is very much in the center of the DAO universe and how do you decentralize governance. And I would say that they're struggling with, I would say, is basically the same problem. And I would propose, that was fun. What am I thinking about? It's either Foucault or Delande that I was talking about, probably Foucault, about the notion of the corporate, as you even said, in fact, you said, the corporate organizational control structure was developed in parallel with and deeply in relationship with the military hierarchical structure, right? Because they're clearly learning from each other and also exploring many of the same basic spaces of how to actually create the right kinds of structures to navigate success and effective allocation of resources and exploration of novelty and propagation of perception and learning, et cetera, right? And so there's something about this question that is sort of showing up across the entire field. And we're going to be dealing with this problem at the level of what we would typically call, say, government. We're dealing with the problem at the level of what we would think about in terms of corporation, right? All the different groups, in fact, even those basic structures are already obsolete as ways of thinking. But the point is the flows of choice making that are currently governed by organizational structures, all of them are going to be undergoing a transformation that is the one we're talking about. Right? So let's kind of get into that. What does that look like? Or how do we even go about thinking about how it looks like?
And I think this gets to the heart of the problem, that the challenge we're sitting in the middle of is, you and I have spoken about this, is it's a fundamental conception problem of how we conceive ourselves, and thereby how we conceive our relationship with reality as we see it around us. We have constructed the world from an object-oriented reality, object-subject related reality, that has allowed for both separation and thereby the permission of violence, and thereby the permission of not only violence, but thereby the permission, the capacity to accumulate and create asymmetric power. So there's a whole, and that journey of us as a civilization has been a journey of language, has been a journey of classification systems, that has been a journey of bureaucratic systems, that is now also a journey of computational systems. And I think what we're reaching is a phase change shift where the object-oriented worldviews, the information systems between them are starting to now entangle. So the entanglement no longer becomes a conception or it's an intellectual conceit. It's becoming a systemic reality as the externalities of these objects start to release. And at that point, we're getting climate change. CO2.
Great. So there's the discovery in the 80s of, in fact, nonlinear science, right? The whole the notion of complexity, which was we had reached the point at which the ability to ignore the entanglements at the micro level of systems that we could pop out and turn into analytic linear systems. And we had a 500-year arc where that particular toolkit of reducing complex natural reality into a series of discrete, analytically separated linear systems had reached its end, because the actual entanglements between the linear elements, and therefore producing nonlinear results, could no longer be avoided, right? We began entering the domain. We're like, okay, everything else that we need to study, which as it turns out includes effectively everything that matters, is not of this kind of linear system. And your point is that we're seeing that explode into all fields, right? It's now no longer the very specific field of certain kinds of science. It's everywhere. Yes, I think this is exactly the case.
And when it explodes everywhere, I think we're seeing a systemic gap where our science has been there for 50 years, maybe even, right? I would say the science, David Byrne, the quantum physicists, the philosophers were talking about this as a reality shift at the foundational level. The cultural and the political and the institutional is a massive gap. And I
would also add the psychological.
Linguistic structures, technological structure. Yes, psychological. I think our comprehension of self, our comprehension of being. I think was talking with Bio, an amazing guy. We were talking about this kind of, and he made a really beautiful point about actually we don't have relationship. We are relationships. And it's really simple, but it's really elegant in terms of. And thereby you have to reconceive the self as being a knot of relationships. And the knot is the emergent form of agency. The knot is the emergent form. And the layers of agency that build off that knot are the layers of cognition. And that's a foundational worldview shift, but it's also a foundational challenge on our psychology. Like, are we individuals? Are we multitudes? How do we accept kind of a new almost like a personal psychogeography, which is actually embracing our multitude at a deep sense. And to be provocative, I think, what would happen if we all had to use the pronoun reality, not just at a sexual level, but actually the idea of us as being multitudes of beings, not singularities. Right. And the idea of the singularity is an illusion of that worldview. And so you're right, there's a deep psychological shift, and that psychological shift is then sort of a descriptive shift of how we see the world. It's also a descriptive shift for changing our relationships to the world. And just to nail it in part of the conversation, I think one of the most iconoclastic moments where we saw the end of this system was the human in a spacesuit in the middle of space, isolated, because that was absolutely super epitome of hypermodernism, where we could understand the human as divisible from the planet. And yet we know, all the science is telling us, if you divide us from the planet, our intelligence degrades very quickly over time, our sexual reproduction capabilities decline massively over time. We are non-divisible from massive ecological systems to which we're associated to. And that recognition of this system and this entanglement is so powerful and profound that I think we have to reimagine our relationship with everything around us. And this is the cultural transformation. Organization is just a second order form.
Yeah. So a couple of things just came up. I want to, I don't know, it feels like throwing wood on the fire for a while. This notion of double binds, or maybe that's not right. False dichotomies is actually the right term. So if we have a dichotomy of labor capital, and what we say is actually neither. Like the right answer is actually that whole struggle was a 19th century struggle, and the right answer is actually to look at the whole thing differently, and that set of questions just goes away. And there's many of those. The point is actually most of the primary problems that we're actually dealing with right now can't be solved in the way that we're actually thinking about them. If we are able to actually change the way that we think, we will discover that they actually aren't even questions anymore. There's a whole new set of questions, but those questions no longer are even valid. The second one is that what I notice is there's a really interesting, it's almost like actually reassembling yin yang. Like we've got this weird thing where like the yin and the yang have been disassembled and then pitted against each other. And we're going to reassemble them. So an example would be some fraction of the population, let's say, has something like at least an intuitive sense of care for the wholeness of world and the relationality of wholeness with world. And yet almost all of that fraction of the population doesn't seem to be very focused on the degree of importance of developing entirely new ways to actually care for that properly. Right? They're focused on endeavoring to express that feeling of care in a high intensity way, but then sort of expecting institutions that were precisely designed not to do that to be able to do that by virtue of just asking them nicely, or perhaps not even so nicely, to do so. And then the flip side is that there's a very large number of people who are actually very vigorously endeavoring to imagine new ways of organizing human coordination and human agency, or agency and coordination in general. And in fact, can't help but finding themselves thinking about these questions like, okay, is it even proper to think about something like multiplicity? And yet, many of them have not actually undertaken the necessary work in their interior to be actually able to care for, truly feel the felt connectivity of whole with whole, right? And there's something about that I think that is also quite necessary, that both sides have to actually reintegrate so that we have that capacity. Yeah, I put a pin on that one. There's some more stuff to go there.
No, I think it's super great. I think it's a two-way problem as well. That I think we can work on the cultural stuff, but for example, if a balance sheet of a corporation, so you take a can of soda, you take an orange, sustainably grown, deeply grown in the environment, soda is soda. The costs of the soda are massively externalized. Carbon, aluminium, health outcomes, sugar impacts, externalized costs, transaction cost, I don't know, 50 cents, dollar. Transaction costs are super low, systematic costs massively high, addictive economy, so it actually creates a consumer demand. Orange, on the other hand, expensive, internalizes costs. So at the unit cost level, it is cheaper to go for the can of soda. But at the system cost level, actually the orange is much cheaper, significantly cheaper. And by implication, we have a systemic problem here that our economy is designed around the Coke can. So there's a problem of actually fundamental balance sheets, theories of value, And unless we structure them, actually no amount of good work will make the conversation work. No amount of good work.
Right.
Because it's not a cultural problem. It's an allocational problem.
Yeah, you could do the same thing at the micro level of things like KPIs. Right. The problem of the control structure of the bureaucratic hierarchy, or one problem, there are many, but one problem is its information processing capabilities. Right? It, in fact, actually can only perceive and propagate up and down the channel, the control channel, a very small amount of actual information. So it has to take the information surface area of the folks who are touching the actual reality, compress that into a very small sampling, propagate that up into the KPI dashboard, so that the cybernetic control system at the top, which is usually 1 to 3 people, have the ability to then convert that back into a series of control statements that themselves are then diversified back down, right? And so the structure implies an information compression step, which itself implies the entire set of trade-offs that you're talking about. By the way, this particular plan is about to die. We've got 10 minutes. I have an open-ended plan, so if we want to continue, I can just send it to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. That would be great. Let's yeah, because I think this is a really fruitful conversation.
All right, so how about I'll just stop now, and then I'll send you a link.
Perfect. I'll be there on that side. Thank you. Bye. I think that just says.
I missed it. That was a great piece. Actually, I will recapitulate it, because that was actually really good. Right. So the metaphor that I was just talking about was at the bottom of the basin of attraction of our current resource allocation function, our current organizational function, is the most fundamental method by which we actually allocate the resources, the capital necessary to do things. And I'll say resources even more broadly. And the problem of that is that the groups and individuals who are actually doing the truly good work of discovering and breaking new ground in how we can actually build new organizational approaches that are fit, they're actually adaptive to the context that we find ourselves in, aren't legible to the resource allocation functions that we've bound our resources to. And so the metaphor I used was, if you imagine an education system where you have 2 groups of students, one group is learning very, very well, and the other group is scoring well on the test. But your resource allocation function only gives food to the students who score well on tests. We will be dead as a culture in 2 generations, but we'll score really well on tests for 1, something like that.
And I think that's a perfect analogy of where we are. Like, score well, dead in 2. And I think, and this goes back to the conversation we were having about, like, we'll score well in terms of GDP because we're selling loads of cans of soda, but we're dead in 2 because the systemic externalities are accruing in a way that they are self-terminating to us as a civilization. But cognitively, it's a systemic problem. It's about how we understand value, how we put that value on balance sheets, what is priced, what is not priced. And in a way, I think the biggest challenge is, I think a generation of us have been playing at the cultural level, but actually we haven't recoded the machine. Mm-hmm. And the machine is like, we are living inside we are inside the machine. And so our actions and behaviors are so heavily orchestrating, biasing our allocation and attention. So you get deviance, you get deviation from the machine, for micro, like goodwill. Somebody goes, yeah, I'm going to buy some oranges. But it's just a micro deviation.
Right.
The systemic structures are biasing towards a particular result. And I think what we've got is a problem where the machine has been coded to a particular theory of value, which is almost certainly self-terminating us now. And recoding of that machine, yes, requires our cultural transformation, our comprehension of ourselves, but it also requires a transformation of our bureaucratic theories of value, of how we understand value and what that looks like. And the current problem for capital, and this is why I think the future is going to be cast by primaries, not intermediaries, is that we're going to be seeing a fundamental shift in value. And that will require, in that process, capital destruction in a way that we've never seen before. And you know, some of the most advanced capital providers are looking at 90%. Like, hello.
Like about exactly appropriate towards proper value.
exactly, proper value. So 90%, we're talking to some funders who are capital holders, we're saying we might see a 90% reduction of value in our current portfolio, because that theory of value is fundamentally problematized. And I think, as you were saying, I think this is how we resource this transition, how we organize this transition, how we understand value in this transition, is so fundamental. It's a deep code transformation, and transformation that we've been living, and classification structures, theories of violence, theories of all of these things are embodied in it. And our current, I would even argue that our current classification through racialization is just a form of the hypermodernity project that is actually driving and intensifying the kind of challenge and the self-termination capacity, because a divisional capacity is almost certainly a pathway to termination, and not just at a racial level, at a territorial level, at a nation state level. These are all false dichotomies to which we become over-embodied in.
Okay, nice. So I want to make a little bit of a shift, I think, but it's what my mind was turning to is, so we can, I think you and I and several others can engage in what at this point I'm going to posit as a sort of a damning critique of the machine, right? There's like 15 different ways to look at it. They all are informative, but the TLDR is, as you say, we have made the classic mistake of becoming addicted to our machine. And that is a self-terminating problem. Okay, great. Done. Great. Now, what do we do? Okay. So when I was contemplating just now, what do we do? What came up for me was an interesting architecture that I've been hearing about and talking about maybe for the past couple of months. I think maybe you and I talked about it maybe the last time we chatted. So another one of these false dichotomies is the dichotomy of market and state. Where for 150, 200 years, there's essentially been kind of a tug of war of, we need the state to constrain the market to avoid all the various bad things that happen in an unconstrained market. And we need the market to constrain the state to avoid all the bad things that happen with an unconstrained state, right? And the answer is, in fact, and the metaphor I used to explain this recently was, it's like Coke and Pepsi fighting over which one gets to dominate the market, but they're both in a conspiracy against water. Right? And what we actually need is water. And so what does water mean in this context? And I think John Vervaeke put it, cultural authority. A thing, some kind of location in the way that our culture operates that is not state and is not market, set of institutions that have this characteristic of cultural authority. And they're going to include things like family, right? And we say, if we want to reflect on value, we're saying, okay, we need to return, and I mean this actually in some sense, in both senses of regenerate and in the kind of the new logo that has the V for the U, to remembering when was the last time we are actually operating in a relationship with complex value at all? And in the West, that's about 500 years ago. And then reinvent, right? It's a double move, right? We have to simultaneously sort of have an indigenous move of actually saying, oh yeah, that's right. We have always been and can't really ever not be fully connected to the whole of wholeness. Okay, cool. Let's just recollect that and reactivate all those elements and come at it from that direction. But also, here we are. We actually have a whole series of capacities and problems that we need to deal with using the capabilities that are at the cutting edge of where we are now. But that location, that third spot, right, of cultural authority, I would propose is the location where things like properly resourcing the exploration and the learning of how to do this kind of thing will ultimately end up living.
So I very much agree. I think one of the things I would say, just in terms of developing this discourse, I wonder whether the problem isn't the machine anymore. The machine is coming networked and alive. And what we have to do is actually accelerate the recoding of the machine to its emergent form, which is it's becoming a symbiotic networked system. Mm-hmm. So the internet has happened. And actually, maybe this is kind of like So I was walking down the street and I saw pigeons sort of walking around. And I was like, all right, so if I was in Matrix mode, I looked at those pigeons, they're the smartest thing around. Those pigeons are self-organizing, automated, coded, generative systems that are self-replicating. The car is a pretty fucking dumb piece of technology relative to the pigeon, right? Just in a kind of just. And I was like, okay, so actually, what we've got is an environment. The car isn't really a thing. The car is a prosthetic for humanity. Mm-hmm. So to understand it as a thing is part of the problem. It's not of equivalence to the generative system of a pigeon, right? It's a low-grade piece of non-generative, linear, non-commandable, non-autonomous thing, whereas actually the pigeon is quite extraordinary. And so if we were aliens, if we walked down the street, you'd go, fuck the pigeon and the human. And you'd go, everything else, like, well, you know what? So, and I wonder whether that means that the city is the prosthetic to the human.
Nice.
To see the city as a prosthetic for the human interaction. And so suddenly what we start to see is that we are being prosthetically interwoven to each other. And actually what we're seeing is the human being prosthetically interwoven to context, and then supply chains, networks, ecological systems. And now we're having to recode ourselves in relationship to the pigeon and the tree. So there's a new form of machine, human, ecological interweaving that's going on. And we're in the birthplace of that thesis. And so the kind of provocative challenge is we don't necessarily need to go back to the family and the tribe. Actually, we might be in an emergent function of being prosthetically interwoven. We just haven't consciously woken up to the reality we're already in there. Like, it's like we think we're somewhere else. Actually, we're already in a prosthetically, globally networked, interwoven system, which is just slowly in the machinations of being recoded and coming alive.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this. The proposal I would make is that it's both. That there's a simultaneous, in fact, the metaphor I think I've used is kind of like there's a downward movement of a reconnecting, and the city is exactly the right location for this. So let me kind of double down on that in a moment, and then an upward moving, right? So there's a proper rehumanizing of humans. That we've been stuck in a very bad spot. We've been stuck in a situation where the generativity that is available in the connectivity between minds has been captured by the embodiment of minds and bodies, and therefore the necessity of creating this cybernetic actuation function for bodies to be concentrated into a location where the minds can be in relationship, right? So this is the city. A city is that, or a city is the unlocking of the generativity of collaboration between minds by virtue of enabling proximity of bodies and dealing with all the consequences of proximity of bodies using technology. And there's a lot, right? It's not just the sort of obvious boundaries of the cities, it's the entire supply chain extending out to the edges of the globe and above. And so the proposition I would go ahead.
No, go for it.
So the proposition I would make is that the part and parcel of the move that we are making now is the decoupling of those two and allowing each to be more fully where they need to be, right? So the human part will end up, I mean, and it's very straight, you know, the yearning for the for nature, right? The yearning for tree, right? Touch grass, like that metaphor. The body thrivingness vector, right? The fact that our minds are, and this is very good news, right? It's good. We don't want this not to be the case. Our minds are very much embodied. And so we want those bodies to be able to be fully nurtured contextually. We want to be able to drink clean water. We want to be able to have relationships with people who we care about. We want that at a very high level, right? And that, by the way, in terms of reactivating value, that's meaningfulness. At least 1/2 or 1/3 of the notion of meaningfulness. And we want and need to be able to fully deploy the generativity of when those minds are able to actually be in high quality relationship, right? And we see the failure condition, or the, how do I say, examples of how the current model doesn't work in lots of different cases. Social media is a great example of how the current model doesn't work. You know, the nature of how, and the language I'm using here is actually from Tyson Yockel Porta. The what does he call it? quantity versus quality, right? Metcalfe's law, city. Go ahead.
Oh, I lost you.
Sorry, we've got a little bit of an async.
No, I think it's great. And no, totally. So two things I wanted to build on. One, I think we have to re-understand the idea of embodied, so the separation of mind and body is, I think, a false dichotomy that's part of the industrial. I think we have to talk about our embodied intelligence.
Yes.
And I think that full embodiment is, I think, going to be the high resolution comprehension of being and becoming. And I think that embodied, and the city, as you rightly say, becomes a massive location for that embodied. And then the second part of the embodiment is, I would say, is the intelligence is dialogic. I think one of the biggest failures that we've made in modern theory is we reduced intelligence to being individualistic. I am intelligent. My IQ versus your IQ. Mm-hmm. And actually, what's more interesting, and I think Aristotle and all the great philosophers actually recognized actually dialogic. It was actually a discourse that formed knowledge and intellect. So if our theory of value is one, we re-embody the knowledge, i.e. we re-embody it in the relationality of the physical, the cognitive, the emotional, and the embodiment, and that relation, but also between us as a relational knowledge to be in relationship. That means that the collective intelligence of the city is more powerful than the individual intelligence. So the emergent intelligence of a city becomes a strategic asset at a value level, as opposed to, well, you know what, we've got X many people that are smart or not, because actually it's that relational function that's going to become the real critical value point. So even our metrics and theories of value start to reorganize towards new forms of intelligence, and they have to be. This really goes back into kind of new theories of value. So care becomes actually a very powerful tool and a very powerful goal, because care in a complex system is really critical because of unintended consequences, and you have to operate in theories. So our emergent function of care is a really powerful function for complex systems. Our relational intelligence becomes a much more powerful function of actually the capacities of that system. Our embodied being becomes much more functional in terms of actually the human contribution relative to a mechanistic sort of a predictive economy. So I think there are whole new value sets that start to emerge, and they become really vital in terms of making this journey. And I don't know, like I just did that thing about the pigeon, right? Pigeon, it's a low-grade piece of biology in some ways, but relative to the car, it's like way off sophisticated as a regenerative, self-organizing, self-determining system. So you start to kind of think, okay, so how we are moving that way, but there's a kind of really interesting idea of how this singularity, and I think we've talked about this before, this kind of theory of a new singularity, a singularity at the function of kind of machine-human ecological systems at the planetary scale. The singularity is the planet becoming a new form of consciousness, a kind of new synthetic machine ecological consciousness, which is extraordinary. And I think just to kind of maybe go back through a conversation we had probably about 2 weeks ago now, where the birth pangs of that consciousness, which is an emergent function at a planetary scale, which required 70,000 whatever sort of years of human resource and knowledge development to be able to orchestrate to this moment. We're at that moment of that, I think we both talk about the Fermi paradox moment, where we go from competitive theory to a new planetary consciousness model. And that emergent transformation is probably the key civilization pivot point. Can civilizations go from competitive evolutionary theory to complex, adaptive, contextual, learning-oriented developmental models? They can. We are in a transition to a planetary consciousness, and we're going to have to get there over the next 40 years as we deal with new systemic sort of scarcities that arise as we make this transition. And that's going to be a forcing function to either go to war, i.e. mutually assured destruction, or a forcing function to build a new form of institutional landscape which can actually deal with scarcity. That is
Yeah, so let me recapitulate that. We had a whole like a serious conversation on this. Let's kind of get the premise. So the premise is, as you said, the Fermi paradox. We're at the great filter, and or at least one version of the great filter. I don't want to say there aren't maybe more, but certainly the one that we're facing. And there's a bifurcation event. There's two paths, and so one path is as you say, something got us here, or more specifically, I've always thought of it as like both aspects of what we're talking about have always been present, but this kind of competitive evolutionary process has been dominant up until say tomorrow, and that got us here. And the problem is that we're now at the end of that, meaning if we progress forward in that direction through a series of different failure events, not the least of which is the escalating power in a zero-sum game, right? Inevitably, that will lead to the end of everything. There's not, you don't have to worry about the specific path that gets you there, as long as you just have the simple calculus of an arms race that has escalating capacity to externalize harm in a zero-sum game, then done, right? And on the other side, we have the ability, the discovery, the awareness now. Oh, and literally the first step, the awareness of that, which probably began to settle somewhere in the mid-century, right? The whole "I've become destroyer of worlds" narrative. And then an increasing consciousness of, okay, well, there's this other side that's actually been present since the very beginning. And in many ways, what we're trying to do is begin to do this, just to tip, right? And begin the migration to more and more of our life being governed by this set of values, exactly as you said, and recognizing how to increasingly become sophisticated in meeting all of our various needs within that particular set of values, which does not mean the elision or removal of these values. It just means a shifting of the relationship between the two. And in that conversation, we talked about each of us coming from very different points of view, like different perspectives, different information, different relationships, but nonetheless coming to a similar agreement that we're on sort of a 2 to 3 decade journey of this transition, where we're going to be hitting a variety of different points of significant challenge, many of them based around resources, others at the second order based around how we deal with problems of resources, right, which is a different meta problem. But if we make it through to a completely new location, a qualitative new location. You call it a planetary consciousness. And I would pose, by the way, for those who have difficulty with disambiguating, planetary consciousness is the thing that is the category response to globalism. Right? If you don't like globalism and where the globalists are taking us, I agree. I think you agree as well, but I certainly agree. The thing that is response to that is this planetary consciousness. Like that is the category. And in that conversation, I said, oh, well, then we might as well just go ahead and call it 40 years, because mythologically, when one is traveling through the desert to the promised land, it takes 40 years, and there's a lot of wandering. But I think that's, we sort of agreed. Look, we nodded. Yes, that is the frame. We've got a tough journey ahead of us where we're going to be hitting a bunch of really intense points at many, many different levels of scale and many, many different domains and modes. And each one is going to push us to the limit of our capacity to grow and our ability to operate in this new modality and become more skillful in operating this new modality. But as we get through it, we get to another side, which is, and you call it's actual abundance, right? It is effectively unlimited resource. And here's the beautiful part, in a way that feeds us, that does not kill us, right? In the current kind of being that we are, the kind of mind and value structure that we have, when we experience actual abundance, we die, right? We become grotesque, we become bloated, right? We don't have any ability to actually thrive in a context of abundance. So another part of this journey is becoming the kinds of beings that thrive in abundance.
I think this last point is really critical. So the scarcity that we're going to experience is a developmental scarcity if we get it right, because it shifts our cognitive, emotional, human agency capacity, exactly the thing, to allow us to actually feel new abundances first, which will be cognitive abundances, care abundances, cognition abundances, the being abundances. These are a whole new class of abundances in a new theory of scarcity. That is the developmental landscape for us to exist in an energy material abundance without self-terminating us in the next phase. So I think you're absolutely right. This is, in a way, there's a sequential journey we're unfolding. And even the multipolarization of the world, I think, is a critical dimension to actually for us to be able to do this. Because without the multipolarization, there is no pathway for understanding multipolar traps as mutually assured destructions. They become asymmetric systems. So I think what we're experiencing is a moment where, let's use the kind of phrase, that at the end of the day, whether it's US or China, it's mutually assured destruction. Like, there is no pathway for one civilization to survive without the other civilization.
Right.
That is the fortunate or the unfortunate reality of it. And people have game theory many terms, but eventually that's where we're headed. And once we realize that, our theory of playing the game becomes fundamentally different. And I think we have not yet built the game model for that. So we're still trying to gamify the competitive theory, but actually we know it's a self-terminating situation, whatever scenario. In that case, somebody has to change the frame of the game. And that is the moment. There is literally, to use your words, game B. Sort of, has to be a totally different theory of the game. And I think that's a geopolitical position that I think slowly we're at the beginning of the game still. So there's a pathway being laid out for pretty visibly, because it's a technological pathway, it's a geopolitical pathway, it's an institutional pathway, where we go from a multipolar world, recognizing having to operate in a new game theory as systematic insecurity or scarcities come to bear. We're going to need new developmental abundances to unlock and operate in that material scarcity, to then unlock infinite sort of material energy sources, which are actually visible on a technological pathway, whether it's fusion, microreactors, all the way through to interplanetary mining, or even surgical mining on the Earth systems. Yep. So it's a really, in a deep sense, people say, like, I'm sure they say this to you, I'm feeling deeply hopeful. The parts of the puzzles are on the table. They're not there. And actually, the politics is going to have to deal with it. I'm less and less looking for leaders. I'm more and more looking for events. The classic line, it's events, dear boy, events that make the future. And I think events are going to be leading our politicians, not our politicians leading us. And I think there's an almost emergent catalytic, self-catalytic reality to this, which I think is extraordinary.
So maybe I'd be interested in hearing you talk about the kinds of things that you've been learning and doing in the context of your organization. Now, you've gone through real birthing pains over the past, let's just say from my experience, at least the past 6 months, maybe the past longer than that. And you said that you've come through on the other side of something. And I'm interested in kind of like what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to delve into it. So I think first thing that's become super clear is the hypothesis at the center of DM is that we are no longer in a public and private economy. That dichotomy no longer works. It's a false dichotomy. And actually, if I was to be really provocative, I would say we've seen the greatest, what's the term? Not enfencement, when we took land and we put fences around it.
Enclosure.
What was it? Enclosure. I think we've seen the greatest enclosure of shared value in the last 50 years that we've ever seen. And that enclosure was a function of, let's use the Highline as an example. We did some work on actually doing the analytics behind it. The Highline Gen cost 174 million to make. Its land value uplift associated directly to the Highline was 3.04 billion. So civic goods spilled over vast amounts of value, which was entirely privatized in the hands of property understood through a discrete object-oriented system.
Right.
So we've lived in a world, I think, of that enclosure of value and the privatization of that value in many, many formats. And now what we're seeing is that the consequences of that, the object-oriented thinking, is also externalizing not only the loss of value, but also climate change and other things. So our fundamental hypothesis is that we are moving to an entangled civic economy. And then what that sort of starts to say is that, okay, so if we're moving to that worldview, how do you reimagine the mundane? Let's imagine a house. So our theory of houses have entirely been allocated to theories of ownership, theories of, let's use a dramatic word just to give it color, enslavement of a house to the single person's utility, enslavement of materials to the single person's utility, enslavement to an ecological system to the single person's utility. We've used government as a means to dampen that enslavement and to control it, but effectively the kind of theory of property has constructed a way of relating to the world. And what we're seeing is that that theory of property is generating externalities, ecological destruction, material waste, linear waste profiles of end of use of that materials. And what that creates is some of the large scale issues that we're dealing with. So how do you reimagine the house as an agent? So moving from the house as an asset to having agency and programmable agency in its own right. And then how do we relate to that house, not as an owner, but to being in treaty with the house, to being a steward, a maintainer of that house for not only your needs, but future generations. So our relationship starts to structure with the world around us, not through ownership and asymmetric construction and enslavement, but to being a treaty. And this is, I think, part of a bureaucratic transformation and a computational transformation we're in the middle of, as we go from a world of dead things and a presumption of death, everything is dead, to now being able to not only presume life, but also be able to bureaucratically organize for life. And I think we're at that tipping point. And that means that, so whether we talk about the house or whether we talk at the level of a city, so the relational intelligence of a city as an emergent agency of capability, how do you see that as a new type of infrastructure? Or tree canopies of a city as a new type of agent, infrastructural agent that has dynamic responsive capabilities.
And I believe that one of the examples you gave me of this a while back that gave me a big epiphany that just popped into my head was, okay, let me sort of recapitulate. So one of the points, and I'm going to say it in a different language just to kind of like activate different people's ways of perceiving it, is and I mentioned most people have noticed when you travel around to various locations, there's a difference between, and I'll actually make that very clear, the difference between a home and a house. And when you encounter a domicile that is related to by the people who live it as a financial asset, or worse, right? As an object that exists exclusively to be, how do you say, disposed of at their will, right? Effectively like a styrofoam cup. You notice that it's shitty, and I'll be very, like, I'm using a complex scientific term, right? It ends up having, it can be quite ugly, it's disheartening, it doesn't connect to the remainder. The neighbors, like you can walk down, I used to live in a neighborhood, I would walk down the neighborhood and there's like a very nice house, actual shithole, like waste product on the sidewalk and trash. And you can feel the vibe of the poor neighbors and like not letting your kids run by. It's bad, right? Bad news. Flip it around. And when you go to a multi-generational home, right, where the grandparents received it from their grandparents, and they're very aware of the fact that they were stewarding it for their grandchildren, and the level of care, top to bottom, all the way, like the awareness of the water, right, the awareness of the plants, the sacredness, right, the child who grew up in relationship with the tree and watched it grow, like that feeling of connectedness at a fully physical level, not at a let's tell an ideological narrative, but you actually experience it directly, is palpable, right? So that's one piece, right? So the second piece is what you were describing is, yes, and nowadays, one of the things that we could do is we can actually, using the technological infrastructure, we can actually give the home an actual agency, meaning literally an artificial intelligence avatar that represents the home in all the different ways you can relate to it. So when I come home, I can say hello to the home, and the home will actually have a personality that can say hello back to me, right? So it creates a new user interface into this style of relationality that makes it easier. And by the way, on the back end, also governs a lot of the qualities from an IoT perspective of what governs the modulation of how our actual relationships are driven.
Exactly, and I think it builds on, but that machine capability needs to build on the ideological frame that you put in about the house that is intergenerational. So it's built on a theory of this thing being a new form of intergenerational public good to which you have deep relationality to. And I think when you root that thing, that new capability into that discourse, I think we start to build a fundamentally different way of being in the world. This is where it goes back to our other conversation. For me, it is not machine as servant. It's about our environment being in treaty with our environment. So if we look at the more animistic sort of relationships to the
Yeah, I
world,
love that language.
it's about,
I love that.
I think it becomes really critical. So I think one of the problems is that our machine discourses are so built out of servitude theories and theories of, and they're really constructed out of employment, servitude, robots, capital. They're built out of a language of enslavement. And I think that's deeply problematic. I think it's going to hold us back till we actually start to use machines and operate in a language of machines in a different way.
And I, as I'm just sort of contemplating through this, I come up with examples in every single case of what proper relationship to, and I will call it kind of like this thing. What did you call it? Treaty, right? In treaty relationship. So I have seen guitarists treat their guitar as a beloved, right? My dad's relationship with his car, it is a being, right? He feels its emotional harm when something goes wrong, right? A person who has a bow, like a bow that they pull, like once you've become in that kind of relationship, you know, that relationship of care with an object, you feel it, like you notice it. And there's something about the only way to truly actually be in deeply meaningful relationship is in that fashion. And so it comes in both directions, right? As we are in relationship with more and more of the world in this dead fashion, we are also separating ourselves from any possibility of meaningfulness.
And not just meaningfulness. I think we generate a theory of waste. We generate a theory of actual discard. We generate, and in the act of generating that discard, we also discard ourselves. This is a mutual, it's a discourse, right? So if we treat the world through a consumer lens, we build ourselves to be consumers of somebody else's consumers. So I think this is a reciprocal symbiotic relationship to which is becoming problematic. And I think this is where our whole theory of consumerism, I think, becomes part of the problem, because actually in a relational world, it isn't about consumption, it is about being in with, and being with in the developmental arc. So every one of those examples you gave are examples of extraordinary relationships with materiality producing extraordinary results by implication. And that's our material. Yeah.
Let me bring back in the point I was trying to make earlier, I think partly about the notion of recovery. And I'll put it in the reverse, which is this process of enslavement or consumerism has over my lifetime spread all the way into the depth, meaning the arc of turning myself into a consumer and turning my wife and my child into a product to be treated as a disposable good has penetrated almost all the way down. So like part of the experience that people feel is the amelioration of even the most fundamental relationships to this blight. Yeah. And I would say that to the degree to which we want to, well, how do I say this? There's many different ways of saying it, but starting from there is a good place to start, right? Don't treat yourself as disposable. Don't treat the relationships that you really kind of know aren't as disposable. And then notice what that, like relearn what it feels like and looks like to actually treat world as a real thing worthy of honor and care and respect. And notice what it feels like when you have done that successfully. And then do more of that, right? From that foundation, like this is that notion of relationality. Like when you're in a high quality relationship with other human beings, that relationship has more capacity, vastly more capacity than any of the sort of distinct individuals as such.
And let's recode the things around us that construct or destroy those relationalities. Employment contracts. Let's reconstruct our theory of how we construct technology as an enslaved servitude provider. How do we construct actually, you know, like let's say it in a bizarre way. Is it okay to be rude to Siri?
No, in
fact. Is it okay? Right. Because the rudeness is not to Siri, it exposes our own rudeness, it exposes our own maleficence. And I think this is where I think it has to be a developmental framework that we have to take with both technology, and we have to not allow technology to become what I would say is a
Right.
control agent, extension of our control economy, but actually an ennobling agent, an agent that ennobles us to be better and grander. And I think that is a developmental arc. We need our technology to be more noble as much as we need to become more noble. And that's a new way of being in the world. And I think it requires us to recode everything, all the basics, all the norms. And that's why I think, and I think we're at that precipice. And I think the constraint of our material economy, you and I talked about this, that, timber supply for the next 30 years is going to be massively constrained. Copper supply, sand, boring, like they're all going to be massively constrained. That constraint is also an opportunity to build this new high value relational economy, the kind of the bow, the guitar,
Right.
all these things become have greater value than the idea of commodities. They become embodied value. They become agents of beauty and co-production with us, rather than actually mere commodities of transaction. And I think there's an extraordinariness of our materiality that we're going to discover as the scarcity runs through the system, and that's a developmental path for us.
All right. Oh, shoot. We've been going for a while. I've got a lot more that I actually would like to get into, but maybe we actually should be wrapping up pretty soon.
Sure.
Maybe just like 15 more minutes, and then we'll wrap up.
Of course.
So let me throw something on there for, and of course, my general theory of dialogue is always dialogue about the most important things. And as we enter into the dialogue, what that is becomes progressively more revealed, and sometimes goes through weird loops that we don't fully understand. So, caveat, the next thing. So the thing that just came up for me that I feel is worthy of discussion is, like, 2 years ago and up to about 6 months ago, I was thinking a lot about what the new kinds of money or currency might look like. And one of them, I think, is I'll present it as an approach. And it's funny, I said, okay, what if we play with the notion of the three different roles, the characteristics of money that are sort of in economics textbooks: unit of account, medium of exchange, and store of value. And I said, okay, what happens if I think about what is a proper, and maybe if I can decouple them, like one of the problematics I'd propose is that because we've actually bound all three of these to a single technology, this creates all kinds of second order and third order effects that are not good. Okay, so what would a proper unit of account look like? And what I came to is, in fact, actually, and I named it Caesar, by the way, the full supply chain, the actual supply chain with fine-grained actual accounting all the way out, right? So instead of a unit of account, it is a system that has the ability to actually show the state and flux of all distinct, down to the atomic level units, and all the patterns into which they are put, and all the various energetic costs of transforming them from a nature all the way through to human, and then all the way exiting back out to nature, right? So it's a comprehensive model of that, right? It's a whole model of economy. And that is the kind of thing that we will be able to do if we focus on it in the next 20 or 30 years. B, we'll have to be able to do to navigate these resource constraint problems, to be able to actually have the ability to know what the consequences of our actions are, and where, by the way, the tremendous amounts of untapped possibility live that we just can't perceive right now. And gives us the ability to do a full accounting, right? This notion of how do I know the cost of the can of Coke? Well, this kind of a system can actually give me the full accounting of that cost of the can of Coke, right? It feels like to a 19th century mind an absurdity, but to a 21st century mind, it's like, yeah, that's an engineering problem right now. And agreements, like how do we actually get the information to flow properly?
And I think
you're good.
No. I was just going to say, and I think actually that's the beauty of this moment, is that we have the bureaucratic capacity, computational contracting, real-time parametric contracting, all of this stuff so most people underestimate the bureaucratic influence of our industrial revolution.
Yes.
And I think we've got a bureaucratic revolution because our technological capacity. Uber is not really a technology, it's a bureaucratic revolution. It's an orchestration revolution.
Yep.
And you're absolutely right that we can now look at, I was thinking about pricing. Like, so let's imagine if one person in a million has a can of Coke or soda, it should be nominal. There should be just a transaction cost. But if 10 people have it, it might be a little bit. If a million people have it, you could actually start to price societal costs.
Yeah.
So we can now dynamically adjust pricing and fiscal capacity and tax and redistribution on the basis of those harm in equitable format, which means that you still have the capacity for the discovery of the new, but there's a dynamic capacity to be able to adjust for system level costs and reprice those. And that gives a feedback system for people to go, what's going on here, right? So if I have more oranges, they get cheaper. If I have more Coke, it gets more expensive. There's something going on
Right.
systematically. We can create those institutional capacities because we have the bureaucratic capacity to do that. And this does not have to be done through a centralized government framework. That's the other part.
That's
the
the other
theory
part.
of public doesn't have to be a centralized government, doesn't have to be through a theory of centralized government. These can be autocorrective, self-selecting and self-organizing systems which are redistributing fully transparently in a way that would never be possible in a kind of centralized government framework and the cost and bureaucratic cost of doing that redistribution. That is a key.
Exactly. Dude, so it's like we're living in the shadow of the British East India Company in like 10,000 ways. And our accounting system, like the notion of an entire way of doing economy and an entire way of doing governance that was developed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And all we're doing is actuating that more rapidly using computational infrastructure. Like, no, let's actually scrap that entire approach. We have a bureaucratic capacity to engage in this level, and let's do it. And if we do it, that changes everything. Same thing. Great. If you're thinking about how we're going to do that using a model of government that comes from that same era, don't. Agreed. That's a very bad thing to be running through a centralized government, global government, global government. That's a terrible idea. It's categorically will be either utterly incompetent or utterly malevolent at the highest level, and usually both. Great. Exactly. Let's not do it.
And that's an emergent function of that model. So it's not about good. There can never be a good. Because when you centralize that much capability, it becomes by itself magnificent because of the risk it holds and thereby the risk it tries to prevent and the normalization of the politics. So it's not a good or bad thing as in like people are. It's a fundamental forcing function of the structure we design. I think this is what we are getting the governments we deserve because of the forcing function of the way we're organizing them.
Exactly.
We can keep thinking of better political parties. That ain't the solution.
Nope.
It's not a political body problem.
And guys, we haven't redesigned this thing in our lives, right? The world has changed tremendously since the 1960s. We haven't done anything real since the 1960s. Great. Let's do something real. There's a whole lot of new ways of doing this, exactly as you say, like self-owning, self-sovereign, self-organizing, human-machine nature combos. Like this is not science fiction in the like a mythological sense. This is science fiction in the let's go ahead and do that sense. All right.
Yeah. And I think we are at the cusp of that reality in every format. And that makes it exciting.
Mm-hmm.
This is doable, like you say, right? And we're stuck in the shadow of the kind of, the great forefathers in a way. We're stuck in the kind of where actually we are the forefathers of the future. And our ability to rewrite our constitution and our ability, the audacity to be able to open up a new theory of being, we don't seem to have the confidence. We're stuck in the idea of a foundational truth that was discovered in the 17th century or the 18th century. Actually, we have to embody our own responsibility and also embody, and I don't mean America as a geographic America, I mean a new land of hope into the future. Yes. And we're so scared of discovering this new land of hope that we're locked into some foundationalism that the truth was discovered in the late 17th century. And I think there's a great moment.
I've got a slogan. A gentleman that was Theodore Mittu, I believe is his name, proposed it, and he and I collaborated a little bit. So the slogan is per estera ad astra, through struggle to the stars.
And I think I would totally agree with it. And I think this is a good way for me, the favorite quote is Interstellar, right? So either we fight for our place of stars. That is a
exact choice we face. We fight for, we'll find a place in the stars. And I think that is the point. There is no survival in this multipolar game. There is no single winner. Either we all die together or we will succeed for us to make this leap. I agree with you.
Nice. All right. Have a good evening, and I look forward to the next time we chat.
You too.